Welcome to this workshop on Totally Tomatoes, presented by Master Gardeners of Nevada County. Here are our presenters who will introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Brott, and I am a Master Gardener since 2005. I've lived in Nevada County for 21 years. My husband and I garden on 3 acres in Chicago Park, and now my co-host, Patricia, will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Wolf, and I've been a Master Gardener since 2009. And my passion is planting everything. We are very excited to bring you an in-depth workshop on tomatoes. So sit back and enjoy.
All right, well, we will entice you first with this gorgeous picture. I believe those are Patricia's tomatoes, if I'm not mistaken, that she grew and photographed a few years ago, which is the ideal intro to this talk. We'd like to be able to encourage you to grow tomatoes in your own yard and enjoy the kind of tomatoes that you can get that you can't get in the store. We'd like to start out with some definitions of terms, and you're going to see these whenever you look at tomato seed packets or read about them in the tomato magazines or catalogs that you get. So let's start with open versus hybrid pollination. Open pollinated tomatoes are long established varieties usually that use the natural pollination by the wind or by insects out in the garden to produce the tomatoes and seeds, which will, generally speaking, breed true each year if you happen to save the seeds. Now, these are genetically stabilized varieties which have existed usually for a long time, and that's what keeps the genetics from varying from year to year. Hybridized tomatoes, however, are a controlled pollination method which is done by humans, in which two different varieties of tomatoes are combined in a very controlled environment, no wind, no insects, and humans will take the pollen from one parent plant and implant it into the flowers of the other parent plant. And that way, varieties are combined, usually trying to achieve specific improvements. And then the seeds from these particular tomatoes do not breed true from year to year. So these are not the kind of tomatoes that you would want to save the seeds from. Now, open pollinated, we'll add one little term here, and that's heirloom. I'm sure you've heard of heirloom tomatoes. Open pollinated, then, of course, as we mentioned, being the standard, reproduces itself true from seed year to year. Heirloom tomatoes, always open pollinated, by the way, are ones that have a history. They basically were introduced or invented more than 50 years ago. Some people argue that it needs to be more than 100 years ago, but they need to, generally they have a history of their own, either where they originated in the Amish community or bred by a particular breeder or brought from Europe by a particular family, but heirlooms usually have a story of their own. And hybrids, as we mentioned, are cross-pollinated with by humans, and they don't breed true to type, and they are usually bred for specific improvements. Now we'll have a couple new terms, determinate versus indeterminate. And as you can see, the arrows, the determinate on the left, that is a plant that is, generally speaking, a smaller plant. It only grows so high and then it stops, and it flowers pretty much all at once and develops its tomatoes all at once. Often these tomatoes are the a paste variety where you can harvest them all at the same time and make your paste, your sauce for spaghetti sauce or canning or whatever, and then that plant is done for the season. Technically speaking, that's what they say. However, determinate plants will usually continue to develop a few tomatoes for the rest of the season. So you can either take them out or leave them in if you'd like a few more. Indeterminate plants on the right are the ones that grow and get to be 6 or 8 feet tall, and they start developing their flowers on the bottom as they grow. And then as they continue to grow, the flowers will be developing all the way up, and the tomatoes will be ripening on the bottom, and then they will go up the plants and develop ripened tomatoes all the way up during the entire growing season. So that's the difference between determinate and indeterminate when you see that on the seed packet. When you are starting from seed, you have to think of a few things. You want to work backward from your anticipated starting date. Usually on the seed packet, you will see instructions as far as how many days it will take before that you can grow the seed before you need to plant it out into the garden a week or two, say, after your last frost date. So you work backward and figure out when you need to plant it. Usually here in Nevada County, we plant in the middle to the end of May. So you can work backward and think that you probably need to plant your tomatoes around about the end of March, which would be just about right. You want to use seed starting mix, not potting soil. And I have several slides later to explain why, but that's the case. You moisten the seed starting mix and you gently tamp it down. You place the seeds in the mix, and you want to read on that seed packet for the depth of planting. For tomatoes, it's 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. And as Patricia has told me, it probably doesn't even matter, up to 1/2 inch, but try to go by the instructions that the seed pack gives you. You then cover lightly with that same seed starting mix, and you water it in a little bit, very lightly, so that you don't disarrange the seed. And you then provide warmth beneath your seeds, usually with a heat mat. That is a really great way to go. They are able to raise the temperature of the soil in those those seed areas so that the seeds will come up faster. You cover them with a dome or just saran wrap plastic to retain the moisture so that they don't dry out. And for heaven's sake, please keep records of what you plant, because just like me, you will forget. And it would be really nice in future years for you to know which varieties you planted and how they worked. Now here is an example of the commercial plastic domes that you can buy. You can buy short ones like this, which are 2 inches. You can also buy taller ones if you happen to be growing in a cold area and you would like to keep things warm as they grow taller. You can buy tall domes. Over here on the right is an example of the saran wrap covering, which is fine while the seeds are just starting to come up to keep them from drying out. Okay, now they've started to sprout. This is what they look like. Then they are going to need lights. So 2 things, they need lights, and you need to remove that cover, because now that the seeds have sprouted, you don't want them exposed to excessive amounts of humidity, which is just going to encourage fungal growth, and that would be very bad for them. So you need to remove the tops and you need to add light. So you remove the covering to prevent damping off, which is a seedling disease, and I will show you pictures of that later. You want to provide some bright light, 14 to 16 hours a day approximately, if possible. And timers make that easier so you don't have to constantly remember to turn them off and on. And so timers that you can buy at any local hardware store. Then as they grow, you will need to pot them up or transplant them into larger pots as needed to avoid root crowding. And that's if the weather hasn't become the right temperature outside to plant them in the garden yet, you need to transplant them at least into a larger pot. At that point, you can use potting soil. You need to maintain proper moisture, not soggy, just damp, because they will still dry out as they don't have a cover on them anymore. Now, as far as when to pot them up, here's a picture of a new seedling. Now, most of you will probably know that these leaves, the first ones you see, are called cotyledons or seed leaves, and these are not what they call true leaves. Over here on the right is the cotyledons, and then the first set of true leaves that occur on the plant after it's growing. After the second set of true leaves starts to come up and gets to be decent sized, that's when you consider potting them up. That's about the right size. Now, planting out means planting them in your garden. Now, I'm going to give you a list here of the various things that you need to pay attention to, and the following slides will be pictures of each one of these. You need to harden them off or get them used to growing outside before you actually plant them outside. Prepare the beds. Decide on your spacing, deciding how many plants you have and how much room you have. You need to plant them deep, and I will show you what that means. Support them as they grow. Mulch them to help keep water in. Water them appropriately. That means not drown and drought, but continual, consistent watering, preferably deep watering. Fertilize if necessary, and prune them, and I will show you that too. Okay, first, hardening off. You want to take your plants after they've now been potted up into a bigger pot than your seedlings start, and they're just about ready to go into the garden, but you need to get them used to living outside. Slowly, maybe an hour a day to start, preferably not into the direct hot sun, but into maybe dappled sun, or just at least minimize their amount of exposure to the extreme elements to begin with, and sneak it up each day so that it's a little bit more, maybe take about a week or a little more than that to get them used to being outside all the time. And you can, at that point, decide to leave them out overnight, as long as it's not raining, hailing, snowing, or freezing. Okay, preparing the bed. You want to take your deep beds, and you don't have to use deep beds. Of course, you can plant them just in the ground, but you'll still need to prepare the ground with either compost or potting soil or both, and you want to mix that in with the native soil so that the plants have good, solid, healthy soil mix to grow in. And you probably want to put in drip watering, because drip watering is your friend when you are growing tomatoes. Spacing. I usually space mine somewhere in the vicinity of 2.5 feet apart, if not 3 feet. Some people grow them a little more close together because they really want to grow a lot of tomatoes, but you want to have them spaced enough so that the foliage has air moving through it that can keep fungus from growing, can keep dampness from aggregating on your leaves, and things that will start growing there because of it. That's usually fungus. Deep planting means this. It means that your stem can be buried underneath the ground, and you can plant all the way to have the dirt all the way up to the first set of leaves, because that stem down below the ground will grow roots. Those are called adventitious roots, and they will stabilize the plant and make it a lot healthier, give you a lot more means to get nutrition to the plants. So plant them deep, and it will also keep them from falling over until you support them. And that support should probably be put on your plants just about when you plant them. Now, this is a trellis that was built onto the deep bed, and you can, I think this has a net on it. Isn't this yours, Patricia?
It's deer.
And I think you can tie, go ahead.
It's deer fencing that is attached to the frame, and you can tie the tomatoes to it.
That's ideal. That's ideal. As they grow, then you can tie them to the fencing, tie them to the sides, tie them to the top when they get there, and support the plant all the way up. You can also use a cage. Now, this is another Master Gardener's deep beds for growing. Now, this is a lot of cages and a lot of tomatoes and pretty crowded, but that's fine. I mean, he's got them all caged beautifully so that when they grow, that they'll be supported all the way up. And he's got them all the way up here to probably 6-7 feet tall, which is great because then you can they can be supported all the way. And cages are a very common way to do this. Please don't buy those little 3-foot or 4-foot cages, because the plant will outgrow them in a month. So tall ones, you can even make them yourself. They are very handy. Mulch them. This is straw mulch, and it's very helpful to keep water in the soil, keep it from evaporating on those hot summer days, and keep things in the soil from splashing up onto the lower leaves whenever, for example, if you get rain. That is a really good way to transfer fungal spores onto the lower leaves of the plant. So the mulch helps you minimize that. And the last slide on tomato care is this. Watering, to begin with. Over here, you have an example of the drip watering system, which is the best watering system for tomatoes. It can deliver the water directly into the soil and allow it to go down as deep as you wish, depending on how long you leave it on. And it doesn't splash up onto the plant, and so that's perfect. It's more ideal to water tomatoes more deeply and encourage deep root growth rather than very shallow watering every day in the summer. That's just not the best way to go. So go with deep watering maybe a couple of times a week, depending on the heat. On the right side here, we have the worst way to water, and I am hoping that you will never do this, but that is overhead watering. That you can see that plant is being watered by somebody with watering onto the plant. That's a terrible idea because it makes the leaves wet and it encourages fungal growth. So do not water overhead. Unfortunately, we can't stop the rain. The rain's going to come when it does, but luckily we live in a Mediterranean climate and it doesn't usually rain in summer here, so that shouldn't be a problem. Next, we have fertilizing. If you have really nice soil and it's well amended with compost or decent potting soil, whatever it is you use to amended soil, you probably won't need to fertilize throughout the summer. Depending on the soil conditions, you may, but that is best known by you. I usually don't, and I usually have very good results from my tomatoes, but every year, I add new compost, new soil, and usually grow a cover crop on the deep beds anyway. So that's also amending the soil. Down at the bottom, we have pruning. Now there's 3 different things, 3 different ways you can prune tomatoes. The first one is the very bottom leaves on the plant, when you plant them, are usually going to be the first ones to start turning yellow because maybe they've got splashed on a little bit, like we mentioned, by watering in the soil, or they're touching the soil perhaps when you plant them. So you need to prune up those bottom leaves on the plant, maybe even when you plant it, because you know that's going to happen, leaving the bottoms of the stem free and clear of leaves that will begin to develop fungus. Over here, second thing you can prune is the suckers. These are little tiny growths that come out between the main branch coming up here and side branches that have leaves on them. You are going to start to grow suckers. Now, if you don't prune those off, they can grow themselves into main branches or side branches. They can have flowers, they can develop tomatoes, but what will end up happening is your plant will be too big, too large, too many leaves, too many tomatoes. They will be smaller than you hope for, smaller than they're supposed to be. And so you should probably remove those suckers as soon as they start growing. If you get them when they're small, you can pinch them off with your hand. So that's ideal. And the last thing as far as pruning goes is you can, with an indeterminate plant that is 6 or 8 feet tall, you can, at the end of the season, you can cut it off at the top and it will stop growing at that point. And instead of developing new flowers and new fruit, it will ripen the stuff that's already on there. And that's ideal for the end of the season. Now, a quick look through pests and problems. That pest right there is one I guarantee that you will see whenever you're growing tomatoes. Probably all of you have. And this is the tomato hornworm. So he's a good announcement to the beginning of pests. Pests and problems you may run into are the vertebrate pests, 4-legged pests, insects, and diseases and environmental problems being the last one. This is the main vertebrate pests that I tend to run into in my yard. Now, as far as this gentleman goes right here, I have a deer fence around the garden, so he can't get in unless I accidentally leave the gate open. But the other pests may be a problem. If you have cages around your plants, this will tend to help keep these guys out. But even though I have all 4 of these types of critters in my yard, I don't usually have a problem with them. I end up having more of a problem with the insects, starting with and mostly ending with the dreaded hornworm. Now here we have 2 different kinds of hornworms, the tobacco hornworm and the tomato hornworm. You can see the difference in the markings. Also, the tobacco hornworm has a red horn or hook on the back, on his backside, and the tomato hornworm has a black hook on the back. That's another way to tell them apart. You don't really need to tell them apart. Both of them eat tomatoes. Both of them are found in this county. Both of them are just about as nasty, and you want to get rid of both of them. The best way to get rid of them is to, I hate to say this, but pick them off. You can wear gloves if you have to, but pick them off and either feed them to your chickens or cut them in half or put them into a container that has bleach and water. That sounds nasty, but seriously, you can throw them out on the driveway for the birds, and they will probably end up being eaten. Here is an example of a plant, a tomato plant. This is probably what you're going to see first when the hornworms attack. You're going to see branches that have been chewed off, no leaves, just branches left. Often the tomato hornworm is hiding back here in the foliage where you can't see him, but you can see this. And so that's the first thing to look for as far as the tomato hornworm's attack goes. This is the adult hornworm, and you probably won't usually see them because they fly at night and are often difficult to see. These are signs of invasion of the hornworm. This is the eggs. They're slightly light green and found on the leaves, often singularly, but not always. And this is the frass or tomato hornworm poop. And you will usually see those on the leaves right below where the hornworm is eating. So keep your eyes open. You'll probably see that before you see the worm. We do have an ally in the fight against these guys, and that's called the Brookhanded Wasp. And they're very common in the county, and they lay their eggs on the hornworms, and the eggs will begin to devour the hornworm, even as the hornworm continues to live. And by the time it gets to this point, these are all pupa of this adult wasp on the sitting there on the back of the hornworm, waiting to hatch. And if you see anything like this in your garden, leave it alone. Don't kill it, don't move it, don't take it away, because that's a really good thing to have around. That wasp is a great friend when it comes to caterpillar demolishment. These are less common tomato pests that you might run into. I usually don't. I haven't in the past. The aphids, thrips, and flea beetles. You don't really need to do anything about them, because ladybugs, lacewings, syrphid flies, all the beneficial insects out there in the garden will help you take care of them. So you don't need to spray the heck out of your plant, which will then also spray your tomatoes, and that's really not something you probably want to do. Over here, bottom right, is white flies. Now that may be a common pest around here. I've had those, certainly. They are often seen in the end of the season when the plants are beginning to get a little old, long in the tooth anyway, and the white flies will start to attack, because as any plant gets a little bit more stressed, pests tend to attack more thoroughly. So the white flies may be there, but that's the end of the season anyway, so you will soon be pulling them out. Diseases: bacterial, fungal, viral, and environmental, which isn't exactly a disease, but it sort of looks like one. The main tomato actual diseases, Verticillium and Fusarium wilt, which are both incurable, and you want to make sure to catch them as soon as possible. Prune off everything that you see that looks like it's affected, and if it's really bad, pull the plant out. Tobacco mosaic virus, damping off, which again is that seedling disease, and blossom end rot. The last one is an environmental factor called sun scald, which is basically sunburn. And now I'll show you some pictures. This is the fungal and viral diseases: Verticillium wilt, Fusarium wilt, and tobacco mosaic virus, referring to that strange mosaic pattern of discoloration on the leaves. The wilts usually come from soil problems, so either plant resistant varieties, which there are many. Keep your soil very healthy. Remove the debris as it falls on the ground, leaves, dead tomatoes, etc. Prune the lower leaves near the soil, and definitely rotate your crops. Don't plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year. I would say 2 years tops. People might push it to 3, but they're really asking for a problem, because these things live in the soil. And if you've grown tomatoes year after year in the same spot, the soil organisms are there waiting for you to plant the next tomato. They don't even have to move very far to get your tomatoes. So move your tomatoes around the yard as often as you can. With tobacco mosaic virus, please don't let anyone, including yourself, don't smoke while you're out there in gardening. Wash your hands, because that tobacco mosaic virus can be transmitted from tobacco products to the plant. So that's something to remember. Damping off, again, the seedling disease is a constricted stem squashed down to the point where the little seedling dies. Here's another picture drawn where you have a healthy seedling and a seedling with damping off, which is going to die. These are fungal spores present in the soil, so use the soilless seed starting mix. And if your seeds grow fast and they are warm, they are less susceptible to this fungal problem. And blossom end rot. That's the one thing you don't want to see on your tomatoes when you go to pick them. If they are facing down, you often won't see it until you pick them up, and there it is. It's a disease that's resulting from a calcium deficiency in the fruit, but it doesn't always mean that you are deficient of calcium in the soil. It may mean that the roots of your plants are simply drowned or rotting because of too much water in the soil, and they can't take up the calcium. So there are many different problems. This is a really good reason why you need to water your tomatoes consistently and not do the drown and drought style of watering. Sun scald, that's the last one we're going to hit here, and sun scald is basically just sunburn. Now you can help prevent this by making sure that your tomatoes, as they're growing on the vines, are covered. You can sort of pull the foliage over your tomatoes to make sure that they are protected from the sun, or you can put shade netting over them to help protect them from the sun during the worst of the heat of the summer. So now I'm going to let Patricia take over and talk to you about the various varieties of tomatoes, our favorites.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm going to divide these into categories, and we're going to start with the cherry tomatoes. And these are tomatoes, all of these groups that we've grown up here, either trialed recently or we've grown for years, that we find do well in our county. Sun Gold really needs no introduction. It's probably the favorite cherry tomato of the United States of America. Who knows, even more. It's a prolific F1 hybrid, and it has the most wonderful flavor. It's a sweet, thin-skinned tomato that I end up eating. It's basically the one I go out to the garden, the sun shining on it, and I just eat them right in the garden. Delicious tomato, good production. They do crack easily. So don't let them get overripe at all. And even if they crack, they're still delicious. Sun Chocola, we started growing maybe, I want to say 3 years ago, and it's a wonderful tomato. It's my second favorite. It's not the sweet flavor. It's more of the black tomato flavor. It's smoky. Again, it's a very productive, good, long seasoned cherry tomato. I think you'd be very happy with it. Camp Joy is a good red, again, really good production. It's larger. It's a pretty big tomato, probably twice the size of Sun Gold. And again, it's good flavor, good production. And obviously all of these cherries are indeterminates. Midnight Snack, Indigo Cherry. It's a beautiful, beautiful tomato. It really needs the sun to develop this purple coloring. The tomatoes that are inside the plant, I find, don't get the coloring the way that those that get the sun. It's very high in antioxidants, and normally it's a very, very good producer. Next. And here's the big boys, the slicers and beefsteaks that most of us really love for our BLTs and caprese salads. Martha Washington is a wonderful, productive, just backbone of your slicer tomato group. It's a medium-sized pink tomato, and this tomato, along with Chef's Choice Orange, for me, are my best producers in the garden. hundreds of tomatoes, I have to say, from like one plant. So they're very good. They'll get, 6 to 8 feet tall and produce well over the season. Chef's Choice Orange, we again started maybe growing about 3 years ago. I find this one, the orange, I grew the pink. This one just has much better production, good flavor. It's perfect tomato. It's kind of an orangey color, obviously. And again, the medium size tomato. Dr. Weitsch's yellow is an heirloom, and this was introduced to us by another master gardener, recommended it, and it's really my favorite yellow now. It is a late producer, so don't despair. And they're huge, really big and really good production and a good flavor. So that's kind of what we're going for with all of these is easy to grow, good production and good flavor. Umaman was new to us last year and it's wonderful. A medium pink again, perfect, doesn't crack the way that a lot of the heirlooms do, which are wonderful, but most of the heirlooms have less production and more issues. This one has good flavor and good production. Madame Marmande is a hybrid and it's lovely. It's a scalloped kind of tomato. Again, these are pretty much all medium sized except for Dr. Weitsch's. And again, just a wonderful producer, good flavor. This is a nice red. So we've got yellow, orange, red, pink. We're doing well. And then we have Pink Berkeley tie-dye, which is absolutely drop dead gorgeous. Beautiful tomato. I think this was a Brad Gates tomato. And the color is a pink with a green sliced on anything is just gorgeous. You do want to pick this one not too ripe because it can get mushy. So, but if you catch it when it's still nice and firm, it's absolutely delicious. Next. Paste tomatoes. Paste tomatoes are notorious for blossom end rot that Bonnie was talking about, which we call burr. The only one that we've consistently found so far that does not get it at all, pretty much, is the Roma. And the Roma is, your canning tomato, sauce tomato, very productive, determinate. I had maybe 3 of these last year in my garden and they just kept on and kept on going. So a very nice paste. Speckled Roman we tried for the last couple years. It's a good tomato. It's huge, pretty, beautiful. I did get some blossom end rot in the middle of the season and then it went away. So the last couple months I was okay, but we're working on it. We're going, in fact, I'll show you a slide of a tomato we're going to trial this year. So next. So our container tomatoes, we're also working on this. The Atlas we tried last year for the first time and I grew this. I was amazed. It's this little 2-foot plant, maybe 2.5 feet, had these monster beefsteak tomatoes that were, I weighed them over 1 pound. And it doesn't have that much production, but it's early. And it did produce over the season. So it wasn't just, the tomatoes came all at once and that was it. So good plant if you want a beefsteak. And it had good flavor and early. So there was a good combination. Galahad was another one we trialed last year. And it also, it was smaller, more of a medium, good production, flavors, okay. But I liked the fact it only got, this one got taller. This was more like a 3 foot to 4 foot. Now remember when you use containers, you want them to be pretty big. I would say at least 15 gallon. Next, please. Okay, so this is one of our new ones and we forgot to do this, but this This is one that we're trialing for, that's supposed to be no blossom end rot. And they're claiming this is a paste tomato. So we're going to go with that and see what happens. I did grow another one that they say is good for canning and sauces, which was Bonnie Best, which was a round red. So we're hoping we'll let you know next year how we do with Gladiator. Next. Redfield Beauty is an heirloom that's definitely not new, but new to us. And we're growing it because it's got low acid, and some people really want to have a tomato with low acidity, and it's supposed to have good production. As I said, it's been around forever. And so again, we will let you know about Redfield Beauty. We are going to go next, please, to the last one. Again, this has been around forever, German Johnson. We just haven't grown it. It's one of the parents of Mortgage Lifter, which is another wonderful heirloom that has a great story about how he paid off his mortgage by selling tomatoes. It's a large fruit, and it's meaty with very few seeds, and it's good for both slicing and canning. So we will keep you posted on that. Next. Green tomatoes. This is actually a slide from a couple years ago of my tomatoes that I was saving, not in the best way. So let me tell you what you should be doing, actually. If you know there's going to be a frost, you either want to pull your plants out if you have a lot of green tomatoes on them. And if you're able to store them somewhere, hang them upside down in your garage. It will be messy, but you can do that. If they're ready to be picked, the best way to do it is to get a box, put them in the box, have them not touch, like my tomatoes are doing right here, and cover them with paper and store them in a cool, colder place for obviously not outside, but in your garage, to ripen slowly. If you want them to ripen faster, you can do the same thing and bring them indoors. And I would also separate the ones that are starting to turn red from your green tomatoes. And that way you can have tomatoes. I've had tomatoes all the way through the beginning of January. They're not as good, but they're better than store-bought. So I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia. That's great. And just to end up here, a few slides, why we like them, pretty obvious. They're gorgeous, they're juicy, they're wonderful, they're better than anything you can buy in the store. They go with bacon and sandwiches and wine and salads and all these gorgeous hors d'oeuvres. They're fabulous to have around. They're easy to grow. And all you need is love and a few good tomatoes. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. So that concludes the main portion. And now I'm going to lead the Q&A session. And we do have a few questions here for you, Bonnie and Patricia. Going back to kind of the early part of your talk, Bonnie, it was about the tomato care slide time. The question is it okay to plant them this close together? So maybe without going to that slide, just about how close together do we do tomatoes?
Okay, well, what I had mentioned was I usually do mine about 2.5 or 3 feet apart. And if you grow tomatoes, you realize they spread out. Even if you keep at it and you prune back every sucker that there is, still the plant is going to grow, unless, of course, you've got one of those little short determinate plants. But the indeterminate tall vining plants are going to spread out. So I usually try to give them room and allow the air to go through them. So I would say 2.5 or 3 feet. That's it.
Okay. And then there were two different people that asked a similar question. What is the best mulch to use and how deep?
Okay. Well, I'd say that the straw mulch is a really good choice. A couple inches, because this is not for the purposes of feeding your plants. It's not going to be, I don't know, disintegrating and going into the soil during the period of one summer. So what you're trying to do is put mulch on there that will keep moisture in the soil and keep the soil from splashing up onto the plants. You could use, I don't think this is a great idea, but I've actually done it. You can use chips. It just happen if you happen to have some, that will do exactly the same thing, but they take so very long to break down that they will actually over a period of time, they will suck nitrogen out of the soil to try to use for breaking themselves down. So I would not use chips as my first choice. You can also use plastic mulch. Some people say that the red mulch, the red plastic, is a good thing to do, but you of course have to make sure that the mulch is permeable to water, because you want it to be able to get down to the soil, to the tomatoes. And you would be running your drip line underneath that mulch, but you could also use landscape fabric. Yeah, pretty much anything like that. That will also help keep the weeds down.
Okay, great. And then two comments about the hornworms. One comment was, and I'm not sure if you've had this experience, use a black light in the night to find them. And also we go out with headlamps to find the tomato worms at night because they're easier to see. So those are
great idea. That's a great idea.
Yes.
Most people aren't willing to do that, but I think that's a wonderful idea. Go for it.
Okay. And then any suggestions for those who live in the hotter climates at lower elevations, like in Big Oak Valley? Do they need to start their tomatoes sooner, or last year? Okay.
I'm sorry, what were you saying, Margaret? Last year, what?
Last year they started too late following regional directions.
Oh, okay. So the lower you are, say even down in the Big Valley, the earlier you can start your tomatoes. And it isn't really a matter of when should you start, it's when can you start. If I lived in the valley, I'd be planting tomatoes as early as I can, because I want to make sure to get them producing as long as I can. Up here in the foothills, you really can't, because you could get snow, hail, freezing, blah, blah, whatever, all the way into May. So you really want to be careful unless you are willing to protect them thoroughly, which of course you can try to do. But if you're down lower, start them earlier. Depends on what your last frost date is, but absolutely start them earlier, definitely.
And if I jump in, also, if it's really, really, really hot wherever they are, cover them, the sun scald and everything else. Use the shade cloth there to keep them cooler.
Great. And now we go to the other extreme. How much sunlight is needed trying to garden on Banner Mountain with less sunlight?
Oh dear.
6 hours. 6 hours.
What? Yeah, I was going to say 6 to 8. She's right. Absolutely. Got to have at least that much.
Okay. And then is this, there was a question, is this Zoom meeting and some of the others online? And I sent a message to everyone saying that with our website address saying, yes, they can find these online. Oops, a few more questions have popped in. If we can do these, can you reuse straw mulch or do you toss it?
Well, I wouldn't toss it. As far as reuse, it sort of depends. I doubt that it's going to last until next year, because you're going to go through the winter, after you take your tomatoes out, and that straw mulch is going to eventually disintegrate and break down and, you know, basically be composted, you could take that straw mulch off the top of your soil and put it in your compost pile if you're in a hurry to get it broken down, or leave it on the soil and turn it under over in the spring, let it compost, and it will be a good addition to the soil as far as soil aeration.
If I could
Okay.
just jump in, I use rice straw for the reason that it does not usually have weed seeds, and it takes a much longer time to break down. And I do reuse it. I have it over my ranunculus and my anemones in tunnels right now in my garden. So I am able to, the only thing you might think about is if you have any diseases, if you'd had any of the, you know, verticillium of the wilts or any of those, you don't want to reuse anything. Toss your plant, get rid of the soil, and toss your straw.
A couple questions now on watering. Any other vegetable crops that do not tolerate watering only 2 to 3 times a week? Wondering if I need to separate my tomatoes from my H2O system. And then asking about any other techniques for deep watering.
Not sure I understand the first part of that question, but he or she is wondering about what you can plant right next to the tomatoes on the same watering system.
I think that's the way I'm
well,
interpreting it.
Okay. I would say, in my opinion, most plants that I would grow in the same deep bed as a tomato, and often I will keep my tomatoes all within a given deep bed together so that I can move all of them to the next deep bed next year, so that I am rotating my crops. But if I happen to be, say, growing melons or even basil or something else in the same deep bed, or flowers, just to make it beautiful, I would say that all of those plants would benefit from deep watering rather than shallow. And I would have no problem with growing them together, and have quite often. If that's what the question was.
And if I could just jump in, I usually have peppers in with my tomatoes because they shade my peppers in the afternoon, or I have flowers or marigolds, you know, and if you need to do a little bit of supplemental watering, you can certainly see if you're out in your garden, which you should be every day, checking your plants. If your other plants start to wilt, you can do a little bit of additional watering for whatever of your crops seem to need it.
Great. Any problem with tomatoes growing in soil that eggplant has grown in? I've been advised to avoid certain fungal diseases, other negative interactions.
Well, yeah, Patricia and I can probably both comment on this, but I should have made this clear. When you want to rotate your crops as far as tomatoes go, you want to move, you don't want to replant any of the nightshade family into the same place as you had the tomatoes. So that's tomatoes and potatoes and any other members of the nightshade family. They're all susceptible to the same diseases. So you want to move put it instead of the tomatoes plant herbs or melons or something that is absolutely unrelated to tomatoes.
Great.
Did you want to say anything else, Patricia, about
No,
that
just
one?
the Pollinated family, that whole family, which you just, you know, the potatoes and the eggplant and all those guys, same thing. So all,
yeah,
you need to rotate those crops. Or what I do, because I take out 6 to 8 to 10 inches of my soil, and I, knock on wood, I haven't had the wilt issues or the fungal diseases, and replace it completely if I'm planting in the same place.
Okay. Final question here. How do tomatoes do inside a clear plastic greenhouse?
well, that's hard, because a lot of people over the world grow tomatoes in a greenhouse. The clear plastic greenhouse depends on how big is it, how much light does it have enough heat, does it have enough cooling? Are you talking about growing it 365 days of the year, growing it over the winter? How big is the container in which you're growing it? Or do you have a place in your greenhouse where you can actually plant it in the soil? It is possible. Certainly, people do it all the time. It's just that all of those things have to be right before it will work.
And that there was one other about tomatoes, growing tomatoes hydroponically.
I've never done it. Certainly, absolutely, it can be done.
Okay. I think that does it for today. So thank you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.